So actually, I'm going to put Justin on the spot a little bit since he's my student. And he's fairly advanced, but he's not a professional. When you approach a new piece of music, how do you go about it?
Well, a number of ways. I like to, depending on if it's a piece that I've been trying to play for a while or it's a piece that you recommend, if I'm not super familiar with it, maybe I'll listen to a few recordings and try to listen to a little bit of a variety just in case the first person I listen to is really not, don't really like their take on it too much. Um, it's good to have an idea of different ways people approach it. And then I'll print out the sheet music, usually from IMSLP, and look through all of the pages. One tip I heard from a former piano teacher was um, when you first approach a piece, try to play through all of it once, just like get through it so you can feel like you've gotten through it once. And then I'll just start usually at the beginning and just start with some really slow practice. Often either depending on the source of the sheet music, I will need to get Tony's advice on fingering or go off of what is already on the page. So that's something to be figured out. But once I have the fingering down, just yeah, really slow practice to the point where I can play the passage through um, without making any mistakes. And maybe I'll isolate one hand. Maybe I'll do a weird rhythm to kind of accentuate the transitions in different areas.
Hmm.
Um, Maybe I'll start in the middle of a passage and then kind of do a sort of reverse practice where I'll play a measure and then start a few measures back and play up to where I was before and keep adding parts in the beginning, just so it's not like I'm playing the piece and the part of it that I'm most familiar with is just like the first few measures of it because I always start at the beginning, for example.
Hmm.
I
Hmm.
haven't really tried this myself, but one thing I'm interested in trying out is starting the piece at the most difficult part and then moving on from there. Haven't really done that myself, but sounds like something that could be nice. Yeah.
Okay, great. Sally, you've taught for many, many years, and you give a different perspective than piano. And I wondered if you had anything to add or observe.
Well, metronome is a biggie. If you can do it as like slowly as possible, like I'd like to at the piano, I like to sit down with the Clementi sonatinas and set the metronome real slow and play all the way through the book. Um, but and I used to have a piano teacher that would have us leave the lid down on the piano and you could practice like on the lid, not the actual notes. I had another one that used to have us stare at the music and then sing it before we ever started to play. Um, but slow practice, what is it? Anything learned slowly stays with you in a while.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. I think so. Well, that segues to something that I think I've told Justin about, but maybe I haven't. Let's see if I can control the video better than this. Um, I've always been a big advocate of slow practice. And Sally, why do you think practice is important? Why specifically does it work?
Well, I think it solidifies things. I've been practicing. Is that mine?
Someone's got a phone.
Oh, yeah. I think it works because it's a good way to get things really, really solid at first.
Uh-huh.
I also I go very much for listening. I like to listen to other people's recordings, like Jason said, that makes a big difference. YouTube has been wonderful, but I think slow practice just helps you to solidify what you're doing.
Yeah, for me, I think slow practice is good if we're mindful, is how I put it. And meaning that, I really know where I'm going and I'm thinking, okay, and of course with the piano it's a bit different than with a string instrument or if we're singing because, we have it all under our hands, we can feel where everything is and there's a predictive aspect to it, I'm going to this position, it's going to feel, it's going to sound like this. For me, practice is very important in kind of programming that. Of course, I'm always thinking about learning something so that I can ultimately perform it. But anybody who really wants to be able to play a piece wants to be able to do it and have fun and not be worried about the mechanics all the time. Of course, I realize there's many levels of that. I mean, when I'm performing, I love to be able to be on stage and close my eyes and literally be thinking, okay, now this part feels like this part feels like that. And so for me, slow practice is an experiential thing where I might be thinking, okay, now I'm going to go to an A minor chord in first inversion. I might not think that. But I might think, okay, it's going to sound like this. My hand has to have this shape because this is the feeling of this chord, of this sound, of where we're going. Hello, Sophia. So good to see Sophia Gilmson.
I'm muting myself.
Okay, well, good to have you. Good to have you. Thanks for coming by. So for me, I think, people always say slow practice, but I think it's important to qualify why slow practice works because, we can do anything. If we're not mindful, nothing's going to happen, right? Nothing's going to stick. For me, the classic example of slow practice for me, I'd been touring with a violinist in Europe, and I ended up in Amsterdam practicing at the music theater, and I had to learn the Ginastera Argentine dances to play in 2 weeks in Brazil, actually. And they're not impossible pieces, but they're fast and they're technical. And I thought, well, how on earth am I going to get these up to performance speed, for audiences of 400 to 500 people in 2 weeks? Well, I remember sitting in the music theater with all these other instruments, and there were dancers and there were people. And I went through that dee-da, 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 da-da. That's the last movement, the last one. And I did it, I made it a stream of consciousness, and I was slow enough that I never allowed myself to make a mistake. I was completely concentrated, completely focusing, thinking about the intervals, the spaces, the distances, emotionally, where do I want to go with this? And you know what? At the end of the 2 weeks, I was able to go, and I had it. I had it really very deeply, because this slow practice, I was ensuring that the notes were as perfect as possible, the rhythms were as perfect, but with the expression of what I wanted to do with the music, So I think, like I say, that's why slow practice, any kind of practice in a mindful way. But then it really, really works. Now, that's not to say that ultimately we don't want to do practice in rhythms or practice with impulses, where sometimes we have to practice the leaps, and so we'll have chordal leaps, and we might go thumb to thumb, and then octave to octave, or we might even go 1 and 3 to 1 and 3. There are times we need to do this kind of practice. But the slow practice is a very important part of that. That's my piece on that. Anybody else have any observations?
I think you brought up something interesting, which is something that I think about a lot. I think in the past, when I started playing piano, I would kind of separate the technical and the musical aspects of it. Like I would think to myself, I just need to get the notes under my fingers, and then I'll start thinking about the musicality. But from what you were describing, it sounded like it was all happening at once, and I wonder if that is always the route to go down.
Well, I would argue, yes, it should be. A composer wrote these pieces. Now, there are purely technical exercises that are supposed to be for working on parallel thirds or sixths or extension of the thumb. But even those, we should always have a musical impulse behind it. And any piece, a Chopin etude is an etude, but it's a musical piece. We always should have a musical line, a musical destination, a goal. And actually, that helps us practice in a more interesting and efficient way if we know, okay, this musically is going to have a climax here, or this is the goal of this section. Maybe we'll practice to that point with this expression in mind. And it's interesting, I feel like I'm being sort of carried on a magic carpet or on a cloud. It maybe sounds kind of funny, but it carries me through musically, and then technically some of these things will follow too. That's not to say I might not have to stop and there's a troublesome part and I'll work that out. But I had another teacher who talked about, there's always a stream of music. I mean, for me, I almost think as if we're tapping into some divine existence of it. Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata is out there somewhere, with the rhythm, with the notes, with the expression, we just tap into it for an instant.
Die reden van unterrichten.
Oh, there's Joris and Minako. I think I'll have to, they're talking, hang on. And so, we only tap into it for a short time. But, we want to feel that. And I mean, it can be an 8-bar phrase. You don't necessarily even need to know a lot about music and say, well, this is really where it's going. Let me see if I can go to that point musically. So Justin, yeah, I think it really very is important that there's always a musical impulse behind what we do, and there's many, many ways of ultimately getting to that point.
Yeah.
Good to see Joris and Minako. They come from Japan. They're in Tokyo, where it's 9:15 in the morning, but they're probably getting ready, so they're busy right now. David, did you have any questions or comments? It's good to see you here tonight.
Yeah, thanks. I'm not nearly as sophisticated in my knowledge as most of the people here, but I do have a lot of experience off and on over a lifetime from practicing in choirs, in bands, and on my own. As a youngster, I went through the public school education of music and learned all of that, and had a year's worth of college music. Eventually went to UT and got a degree in radio, TV, and film. So I have a lot of experience with different parts of music. And later in life, I started learning more about jazz because it was an area of music that I hadn't really, I didn't have a jazz background. I had classical music and choral music and some, listen to symphonies and some stage band stuff and some music theory. So going into jazz, I started understanding that, the technical aspects and the practice was the vehicle or the method or the means to get to the point of the music, which was to feel and hear and feel and experience and create the music spontaneously, improvisationally. And that was my goal, was to be able to play anything I could hear. Or anything I felt like playing. And I didn't even start as a keyboardist, but that's where I gravitated towards later in life. So, but it's only one of quite a few instruments I enjoy playing. So hearing what I want to play before I play it, and sometimes it's a happy accidents is what they call them. Sometimes I play something I didn't know I was going to play, and then it was a community band exercise just I think it was just about last fall or maybe January or so, when I was playing with a band, and we had a guest instructor or guest conductor performer. We were going through, and this is a community band for beginning adults who've never played an instrument or maybe put their instrument down for decades and then got it out of the closet and brought it back, So it's a brass band. But, I mostly fill in on percussion because, you can't march around with a keyboard. So, but it's hard to do anyway. So one guest instructor and, Lauren Gould, I'll just tell you it was Lauren because some of the people here know Lauren.
Oh yeah, of course, she's great.
Yeah. So Lauren was leading us through Iko. And, Iko, and the lead sheet we had was basically a chord sheet, like you get in your real books, things like that, without even the leads. Because Lauren is real big, as you know, Lauren is real big on playing anything, anytime, anywhere, and she can take the right note and the right rhythm and put it in the right place at the right time, and then she goes back and does it every time, over and over and over. And I've commented to her about it. I'm not telling you secrets. She knows she does this. That's her goal. is to play what you hear and to hear and go beyond the sheet music, because you know it's the point of jazz is to be spontaneous, improvise. And so she told us to play anything, and you know, because I paused. I'm from, you know, in the group. I stopped there. Anything, I asked. You know, she said, yeah, anything. Because so that I understood that to mean play beyond what you think you can play. That was my interpretation. Was like, take your limits, take your experience, take your education, use that, but then go past that to explore something that you don't know you're capable of, and make mistakes, take chances, because it's improvisation, but don't be safe. You know, go past that into an area to explore something that you've never thought you could do, thought you could play. And I did that in that particular 10 minutes of I Go. And I hadn't, and that was kind of a freeing, because usually I'm all about the technical. I like to play the technical, but I'm not good. I'm not a good technician. You know, I have a disability, and people can't tell from this. Okay. I'm sitting in a wheelchair with polio. So my technical limits are basically neuromuscular, you know, but then, so I was real excited that Lauren gave us the freedom and the opportunity and the encouragement to play anything, because that meant, and I told that to one of the tuba players afterwards, is, you know, they asked, how did you know to do that? And I'm like, I didn't, you know, my fingers, sometimes I can tell my fingers what to do, but sometimes my fingers have a mind of their own. And, you know, if you have command of the scales and the key signatures and a little bit of theory, and, you know, you can play your way through the 1-4-5 in any key, you know, that's pretty much where I'm at. You know, I can get through a song comfortably. And I can actually read music. I was a really good sight reader in choir, and, you know, I learned a little bit about chord structures and song structures from playing guitar for a couple of decades as a young adult and a teenager. So I have that going for me. But one thing, I do have interest in how other people learn, and because that helps, you know, expand what your possibilities are. Is, you know, maybe I'm not learning this right, or maybe I'm not learning in the ways that are appropriate for this piece. And I was watching a YouTube on Vladimir Horowitz, whom you would think can play anything, right? But he had a daily practice regimen, and he would actually play scales. And it's like you were saying earlier, he played scales musically, and he would go through scales, and he was telling the interviewer that was he practices scales on a regular basis. So that was kind of encouraging to me, you know, that somebody that great would, in classic, renowned, would admit that he practices scales. But I do have a question about going slow, because I like going slow through a piece. You know, I like to feel it. If I'm going to learn it from a sheet or learn it from ear, you know, I will go through it to have a grasp of it, like some people were saying earlier, and then build, you know, get it up to tempo over time, over a few practice sessions, or, you know, get comfortable, and that way you don't have to stumble so much, and hopefully you're not learning wrongly or incorrectly, or you're just learning at a pace that's comfortable, which is, you know, what I try to do. But some of the band members that some of my associate band members playing horn, trumpets, etc., they like to play at tempo from the first. And I always thought that was because they, you know, there's only so much wind in your lungs. You have to get through this phrase in this amount of time, and, you know, you might as well learn it at tempo if you can do that. You know, some of the members of this Locomotion is the band that's a spinoff of Minor Mishap. So some of the members of Locomotion are professional instructors. You know, there's a few, and most of them are people who are either returning to instruments or music, or like me, later in life, or coming around again, or maybe they're first timers. They've never picked up an instrument in their life. And so I think it's important to be able to play slowly, but play correctly, and then build it up to tempo. That's my preferred, and that's my lifelong. That's the way I've always learned how to do it. But I can be wrong. So what do other people think about that? Is it always necessary? Oh, and here's the second question, because I don't know the answer to this. How do you best apportion your minimum amount of daily practice? Do you spend this much time in your weak areas and this much time in your strong areas? 15 minutes. I've heard the 15-minute rule. Practice something for 15 minutes and go away, and then come back to it. Because after 15 or 20 minutes, you're not really learning anymore. You're kind of going through it over and over. So how do people feel about that? How do people do this? Spend their practice time?
Well, you raise a lot of interesting questions. Is anyone else?
Sorry.
No, very good. It's great, actually. Is anyone else chomping at the bit and wants to say something before I say something? Because again, I want other people to be talking, not just me. Is there anybody else who is dying to say something?
I have I could respond to a few things that you mentioned. When you're talking about the sort of freeing aspect of certain ways of looking at music, I think one thing that was interesting that I learned from you, Tony, was the idea of like always just playing something at the slowest or as slow as you need to be able to play it right. But there is something in trying to speed up the tempo to something that you might not nail all the notes, but if it's like a fast run in a piece, then you kind of need to learn the motion that it requires at that speed, and that really is only something that you get when you kind of push your boundaries a little bit and just go for it. And I think it has its place, and both components of that have their place. But that was something I didn't really consider before. That was just something that came to mind. Yeah, I can respond to some of the other stuff too, but I don't know if we.
Well,
how do you want to structure this?
let me address playing things to tempo. Because ultimately, it's interesting. We had to take this class called 398T, even though I'd been teaching as a teaching assistant at USC for a couple of years. We had to take this course, and Bob Duke taught it. And one of the things he said in his educational way was that we as teachers need to be educating the behaviors that students need in order to succeed. Well, that can sound like a bunch of gobbledygook, but it actually makes a lot of sense. First of all, it's, how does a student actually have to be in a lesson so that they can get information and be productive and learn? But it's also, if I practice a fast piece only slow, I'm probably not, my story about, the Hinastera dances was a bit of an exception because, of course, ultimately I did play it fast and I did practice it quickly. But we need, how we use the muscles, we'll really get a sense of security from the slow practice. And as I say, the distances, the intervals, and how it feels. But, if it's going to be a fast piece, it has to be practiced fast. And, there are teachers that will go with a metronome and have you go over your target tempo so that you'll have that security. Now, there are some session players, really professional musicians who are learning music all the time, who, of course, they can basically just sit down and play anything at any tempo. And that's great. That's great if they can do that. But to have gotten to that point, I think they really have had to go through these steps. And there's one other thing about that I'll mention. When I'm on tour, I can actually get away with doing slow practice of a program all the way through twice a day. Because when you're on tour, you don't always have access to an instrument. You don't always have, and you might have an hour, You might have an hour in the hall, and that's that. Because what I've discovered is on tour, when I'm really pushing my fast pieces, they start to get corrupted. It's like computers get corrupted and you have to reboot them or reallocate or whatever it is you have to do, right? And, so maybe it's my failing. I don't know. I don't think so, though. I think this is a more common thing. I would always have to go back to ground zero and, do my slow practice and set everything. And in fact, the day before I play fast pieces, and actually the day of it, the morning, my run through, I may play some of the things up to tempo if I know they feel good, but I'm kind of setting it so that I can really give my all, because when you're playing full tilt, you're giving even more emotionally and physically, But the session players in LA, you put anything in front of them, they can just play it, and it's professional right there. It's different. But I think that's one of the issues that David raised that was very interesting. What was our second question, David? I've forgotten right now.
How to apportion and how to prioritize your practice sessions.
Well,
What's important?
That's an interesting question. It depends too, on how much time. And again, practice is so dependent on what the goals are. I mean, when I was at USC with Daniel Pollock, and I was probably supposed to be practicing 4 or 5 hours a day. Levine had this whole technical regimen of scales and double sixths and double thirds and dominant seventh arpeggios and all these things that you would spend an hour. You're supposed to spend an hour practicing them. And the thing was, you could then in a piece be like, oh yeah, this is an E dominant seventh arpeggio. Oh yeah, here's my A flat minor scale. And it's like knowing a language well, right? We don't have to think the words; they just come to us. It's a type of expression where we just feel it. But that's if you're practicing for 5 hours. Sometimes with students who are practicing an hour, I might have them spend 10 to 15 minutes on technique. But it depends on the age, too. With an 8-year-old, they're not going to be practicing an hour very often, and you're not going to get them to be playing scales and chords for 15 minutes. For an adult, it's different. And again, I say it depends on the goal. I think it's important, for instance, at the piano to know the arpeggios, the regular majors and minors, the dominant seventh arpeggios. To know things in contrary as well as parallel motion. It's important to know the scales. It's important to know the chord progressions, some of the cadences, so that we say, oh yeah, that's what's happening in this piece, because it does improve the learning of the pieces. And then what I find, Justin, is it easier or harder to play, for a lesson, to be practicing 1 or 2 or more pieces during the week? What do you think, as a student?
I think that's kind of tough to answer. It can really depend. I think it's nice to have multiple pieces as a sort of source of motivation, where you can really be honing in and targeting on one specific part of one piece. And so in order to not get burnt out, you can kind of switch over to another piece and do something similar over there, and it doesn't feel like it's too monotonous throughout the week.
Yeah, I think it's helpful to be practicing various kinds of things, to have a variety technically, musically, and then it's interesting, Anton Nell, who teaches, he's the chair of the piano department at UT, and I did my undergrad recital with him. And he actually said, you needed to have, whoops, I did the wrong thing, sorry. That some days you just practice one piece or one set of pieces, and really immerse yourself in it, and then you might go a day or two when you're practicing other things. I do think that a certain kind of variety is the spice of life when it comes to practicing too. I think there's days you've got to very religiously allocate time for everything and cover everything. But I also think, another thing, when I was teaching class piano, Marianne Usler would talk about how we would sit down in these planning sessions and she would practice, every 3 minutes, we're supposed to be going to a new activity. This activity is supposed to lead to this activity, which then prepares for that activity. Now, that's, if we don't have a lot of time, that's really an efficient way to think about it. And also you can be choosing pieces in a program that are going to enhance that learning, enhance that process too. But a lot of people might not want to have that level of work and integration and thought, and that's okay too. But it's possible to be very efficient that way and very productive that way.
Yeah, that's someone could go ahead.
Well, go ahead, because I have a follow-up question, but I don't want to get off this too soon.
Go ahead, Justin.
Yes, one tip I heard from not a piano teacher, but this guy online, Justin Sanderco, justinguitar.com. His advice for learning, practicing guitar was, in order to make that really focused work happen, you can just get like a kitchen timer and set it for 5 minutes or something, and then just really hone in on one thing for those 5 minutes, just completely dedicated to that. And then you can take a 30-second or 1 minute break or whatever, and then set the timer and then move on to something else. I think that works well if you are doing like lots of scales, arpeggios, different kinds of like finger gym type activities. in addition to just learning pieces.
Yeah, that kind of immersion is very important. You know, it's kind of like if you go to Paris and maybe if you were there for half a year, you'd actually start to speak the language. I mean, I find that if I'm there a couple of weeks, I can start to recognize it far better, you know, and it's true that, you know, we're creatures of habit and we do need that kind of immersion. And of course, I think it's also interesting that you mentioned improvisation, and that's a whole other issue that we could talk about, that I think is very important. How do we, I mean, because you know, those of us that are trained as classical musicians, unfortunately, are not trained to do improvisation like we once were. If you went back to the time of Haydn and Mozart and Bach, I mean, some of them were improvising in the churches every week to be able to play for the service. And it's something, how we're trained to be so rigorously predictive. You know, how do you get so that you can go off the score and go off and create something new? Of course, it's ultimately a kind of freedom with the language, I think.
Yeah. I have well, when I was younger, in my 20s, I have a friend, Adele Jandressy, who great keyboard. She played organ. That was actually her major, and she played organ, and she went on through, you know, the whole college level programs and stuff. But she would be amazed because we'd be at a party or something, you know, with other friends, and I'd pick up guitar, and another friend would pick up guitar, and we just start jamming. And she'd just sit there in amazement. And this woman had complete fluency. She could read anything. She could play all the classics. She knew the orchestral catalog, the organ catalog, and she could not improvise at all. And she didn't understand. She'd sit there with her jaw dropped that someone could play, you know, the Eagles or Bob Dylan or something like that, just out of their head. And I didn't understand why that was a problem for her, because she had the technical capability. She just didn't have the comfort level or something.
Mm-hmm.
But so my other question, now that you reminded me of that, is what value, since we're talking about practice mostly here, what value is, or how do you create more value in a practice journal? Because that's nothing I've never done, but I've read and heard some people do that.
Can anyone address that?
A practice journal, or what is a practice journal? First of all, most people don't.
Lena, you were nodding your head. Did you have anything to?
Well, I started to keep a practice journal, and it's just mainly, I kind of fell off of it last month, but it was really actually helpful in June when I was keeping up with it every day. What time of day I practiced, how many minutes of what the practice session was total, and then what pieces I'm practicing that day, as well as what scales. And then I would make little notes about what I felt went well and where I felt like I needed to focus on the next time. And it was helpful. It's just, you know, keeping up with it. It's, you know, that every day getting the journal out and saying, okay, being very meticulous about the amount of time that I'm putting into it and so forth. But I did find it helpful.
Mm-hmm. Sophia, did you ever have your students do practice journals? There was a question about those. Because she might really have something to add that would be interesting.
Yeah, I do. Can you hear me?
Yes, now we can.
But I don't know where I am. I lost myself.
We see you.
You see me?
We do see you.
Oh, okay. I don't. All right. I just recently I always do with them what we call a practice page. So when we accomplished a portion of practicing, I ask, what was the most important things that we have just discussed? And if I work with 7-year-old, 6-year-old, 8-year-old, the answer can be surprising. So we worked on a little fragment, and we did this and this and this and this and that. And it got better. And I'm asking you, not you, a little child, what is that we have just done? Nothing. How is it we have done nothing? We have done something, didn't we? Nothing. So it's not unusual. So my next question will be, what was the last thing we did? The last thing. You said it was good. I said, well, what can you remember what was before that? Oh, we put hands together. Yeah. Do you remember what was before we put hands together? Nothing. So how is it? We started with hands together right away? Oh yeah, I remember. You know, it was so strange, the child tells me. You told me to start practicing with left hand, not with right hand. I always do. So little by little, going backwards, we restore the whole picture. When we start taking notes, when the child can write fluent easily. When we start taking notes at the bottom of the page because we think about the very last thing we did. We can't remember anything. We did nothing, you know. So the last thing that we did at the bottom of the page was, she said, good. Okay. What was right before that? And through Socrates' questions, we finally get to that, yes, we played hands together. And prior to it, we practiced right hand. But prior to right hand, we practiced left hand. And before we started practicing left hand, we clapped the rhythm. And that's how we go to the beginning. And you know what was at the beginning? You will never guess. The title of the piece. And the title of the piece said, Happy Morning. So we knew right away that we were somewhere in a happy morning.
That's great.
Yeah. So just very recently, Tony, you are on Facebook with me, right?
Yes.
I posted a practice page from my 9-year-old transferred student with whom we started in May, and we didn't have one single lesson face-to-face. All our lessons were online, which is, of course, I'm not going to tell you what I think about it, but we do what we can.
Yeah.
So I asked him, after we've been having lessons now, what, mid-May, mid-June, mid-July, almost mid-August, almost 3 months of lessons. I asked him to put a page of important steps for practicing. And he did. He put 9 steps. I asked him to leave this much space between the steps because we are going to develop and insert and continue to work on this practice page. I posted it on Facebook. I don't know if you saw it or not, but it was in his writing, and many people liked it. He's 9 years old, and today I asked him to start a new page. How to prepare yourself for a performance. Yeah, so next week we are going to play in Carnegie Hall, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. And so what are we going to do to make sure that when we get on stage and take a bow, we do it right at the first time? Because on stage of Carnegie Hall, you cannot practice on stage, you have to play. And that's how we establish difference between practicing and playing.
That's good.
Okay, you have to stop me because I never stop myself.
No, that's great. It's great to have your perspective on all this.
Thank you, Sophia.
You're welcome. Where am I? I don't know how to do it.
Press the button that has all the little. It is a bit confusing going back and forth, I must admit. I don't, I don't actually have a lot of recent experience with journals myself. I will have the students do it so that they're kind of keeping track of what they're working on. I like Sophia's creative approach to this, the Socratic way of bringing it out, and I think this is good. For me, I think at best, it helps us, we'll get ideas that we're not going to forget. I mean, I have to write a lot of things down or I'm never going to remember them, And then we can sometimes see a thread, week to week, day to day, you know, of where maybe we're going with things, and maybe we want to change a focus, you know. It can, of course, be as detailed as we want. But I think, again, it goes back, you know, full circle a little bit. It makes us mindful if we have a journal, because then we have our goals. And then maybe midstream, as I said, we change those goals, you know. Anyone else want to weigh in?
I think that was the most helpful part of it for me, was just helping me to stay mindful of what I was doing, what I was over focusing on. So pieces that I would practice much more, what was I avoiding? Because, you know, after a while, you're not really aware that, wow, I have not practiced this difficult piece in a long time. Am I avoiding it? Until you take a look at that journal. So for me, that mindfulness piece is really what I found helpful.
And if we're juggling a lot, it might be a way to keep us on track, to make sure we're preparing everything too. That's also possible. But I like the idea of personal growth and of reflection and of, you know, kind of seeing where we're going. And maybe I tend to forget things, you know. I mean, like, I get migraines, and, you know, the doctors say make a migraine journal. So does Sophia. She knows how horrible it is. Today, I was so happy to have my piano tuned today. I love it. But I had to get out of the house. It's just too much, you know. And so I was out in the heat of the day, and I'm going to be all right, but it's iffy. But the doctors always say have a migraine journal, and, you know, to figure out triggers, to try to have avoidance, you know. So, again, it's about being mindful, I think.
Okay, since I lost myself for good,
Okay.
I mean, I'm nowhere.
Well, we see you. I see you anyway. You're spotlight now.
That's nice. But I have to sign out now. But before I do, Tony, I want to ask you, you have a concert, right?
Yes, on Sunday at 4.
And Sunday and 4, and you will post a link, right?
Yes, I will post it again. I'll send it to you. The link is in the announcement, but I will post it so it's explicit too.
Okay, thank you.
I'll be playing at Adams, and we'll have it on Zoom.
Yes, it's on my calendar, so
Right.
I just wanted to make sure that I know what to click on.
Wonderful. Yeah, I will, and I'll also personally send you the link too, so there's no question.
Thank you.
Be happy to have you. Thanks for joining us tonight.
Pleasure.
Nice to
Bye-bye.
meet you.
Nice to meet you, all of you.
For those of you who don't know, Sophia just retired as a pedagogy teacher from UT. So it's wonderful to have her weigh in today. Now the controls are a bit funny. I don't know, David, did we address, I don't know.
Yeah, it just seemed like I wasn't sure of the value of it. I know it's always, well, in life, it's always helpful to know where you've been in order to find out better where you're going, whether you're reading a road map or
Right.
going, you know, finding your way through life. But I'm not sure. I think it was Lena who described it. She didn't use the word tedious, but it does take time, and to you know, separate practicing writing, handwriting, you know, and maybe my hands are tired by then, and maybe I shouldn't be doing more activities, you know, by that time. But maybe I shouldn't be practicing until the point of exhaustion either. So,
Probably
you know,
not, right?
yeah, that's probably, yeah, I know that. And still, yet when you get into the role and you're having fun and you don't care about the, you know, the fatigue or the pain, you just want to keep playing. So, but I just didn't know how much value other people were finding in it. I've started considering doing it myself, you know, just for, like you say, reflective, or, you know, having a moment of reflection on what you're doing, and, you know, being mindful. And it helps you track your progress. I just I haven't done it in life, and, you know, and I'm not a journal kind of person. You know, I'm a go play it or go do it kind of person.
Yeah, that's my impulse too, is to just go and just do it. And that has its flaws as well.
Oh yeah, Oh
I
yeah.
love to live in the moment, and that's the reason I think I like performing so much. Is that it's not about me. I mean, the only reason I get on stage is it's not because I'm trying to glorify myself, but I love that moment when we can try to reach the audience, we can communicate, we feel the energy back from the audience. Of course, the irony with classical music is that we have to really practice in a rigorous way to be able to do that, right? You know, that's not to say that the jazzers, you know, like Keith Jarrett or a lot of the rock people, you know, they practice. They have to work to get to their point, but they know their language so well that they can just kind of go off. And that's what we're doing when we're learning a piece, is we're taking these abstract symbols, these dots and these lines and these dynamics and so forth, and we're trying to make them into music. You know, we're trying to make a certain freedom with it too. I mean, none of us like it when we're trying to play a piece and we're afraid to hit the wrong note, right? And we don't really know where we're going to go with it, and it just feels like we're on pins and needles or we're about to fall through the ice, right? We want to get to the point that it's like second nature, you know, like it's practiced to the point that it's spontaneous. It's a bit of an irony, but that's really what practice, I think, is about. I don't know, John or Joris and Minako or anybody else have anything that they want to mention? And if you're just watching and lurking, that's okay too. We're happy to have you. I'm glad so many of you showed up today. You know, you never know what to expect when you try these things. Now, I want to try to do this every week, and of course, I'll still entertain some questions. But what would be an interesting topic to do next week? Any votes or any ideas?
I think one thing that you mentioned, Tony, is that a goal of your teaching is to give students the knowledge to be able to eventually figure things out for themselves. And I think that for me, the biggest obstacle to that is fingering. So I'd be curious if maybe we could have at some point an in-depth discussion about that. And I know that might be a little tough just to kind of talk about it. Maybe that would require some more, like, specifically looking at music and talking about the, you know, weighing different values of strategies of approaching it.
Well, I think that's actually very, very important for those of us that play the piano. I mean, I obviously can't address fingering on the violin because I'm not a violinist, you know. But fingering makes or breaks it, and it goes back to patterning. I mean, and actually it goes back to the very beginning stages of learning a piece. There's a stage, of course, where I think we need to sight read through the piece, and maybe we kind of stumble through it. You know, it's kind of like we see that mountain, and it's like, well, all right, am I going to be able to climb it or not, right? And once we kind of play through it, we sort of see, oh, that part wasn't so hard, or boy, that part was hard, or these are the places I need to work on. So, I mean, one thing, so you could bring some pieces next week. You could maybe have good shareable pictures that we could look at. And I mean, I've got the piano right here, obviously. And that's something, you know, we could talk about that because, you know, we talked about scales, we talked about chords, we talked about arpeggios. You know, the thing is, if we have that, we can sort of plug that fingering in when we see these passages. And then, of course, there are other passages that confound me. You know, I mean, for instance, Schumann is a wonderful composer. I love to hear him, but his pieces just don't fit my hands very well. Partly it's extended. Partly he also ruined his hand because he wrote these impossible extended things that are like, you know, this gets locked, tendonitis machines, you know, tennis elbow sorts of things. So I think fingering is actually critical because, you know, it enables us, you know, those sight readers who can do the studio sight reading immediately know what to do with fingering. They can just plug in all these patterns. And so fingering gets to another thing which I think is important, which is patterning in music, because that's what we're ultimately looking for when we read and when we play. So I'd be happy if people could even send them to me beforehand and I could think about it, but I could also take a quick look, you know, within the meeting. That could be one topic. So why don't we definitely do fingering? What's another thing we might want to talk about next week? Maybe let's have two things.
I think for me, maybe it goes along with what Justin, what you were talking about, that just sight reading fluidly. Because for me, it's painful to dissect a piece, you know, like I'm looking at a piece I'd really like to learn, I could listen to it on YouTube, or hear what it's supposed to sound like. Maybe if it's a new piece, it's not even been performed before. But then it's like, how do I have a hard time with sight reading and fingering. I guess the two, it feels like the two go together, and for me, that's my weakest.
Well, absolutely, yeah. And sight, I mean, I've taught sight reading. I've been in score reading classes where it got very advanced, where you were, you had maybe 3-part scores. You were singing one part and then playing the other parts, And so I'm not going to make you do something like that, but there are definite ways, we might, I mean, the whole point, of course, is to keep going. It was very, very painful, but when I was 14, I went to Marywood Music Camp, and this older woman with kind of a smelly sweater, but we were sitting next to it, and she said, keep going, keep going, keep going. And I was just like, and of course I had a horrible time with dotted 16th notes. It was terrible when I was 14. I thought I never could play dotted 16th notes, but it forces you, that's true. There's nothing like playing duets to work on sight reading, honestly. Isn't that true, Sally, playing with other people? But, also you can leave things out. And those of us who accompany know you really, I mean, these reductions of orchestral scores are ridiculous. They try to throw in the kitchen sink. And, you have to kind of learn to prioritize. And so sometimes it means playing downbeat. Sometimes maybe you can play beats 1 and 3 if you've got a 4-beat structure. Sometimes you just play chords. I mean, the George Shearing method of jazz, where he had these different chords that, and Bill Evans actually picked up on it. But, you start to play bits. You give just enough. And, I mean, I have a very specific way I teach that kind of sight reading. But, sometimes it's what do we leave in rather than trying to think we have to get everything the first time through. Because moving forward with most of the information, or as much as the information that makes it seem like the piece. I mean, how much of Beethoven's 9th Symphony or Beethoven's 5th Symphony can we get away with taking out? And have it, I mean, I can go da-da-da-da, and what piece am I talking about, right? I mean, it's kind of crazy that, that sort of defines it. Of course, it only defines a tiny part of the piece, right? But, the same thing is true with sight reading. You can actually leave out a surprising amount of stuff. I mean, I actually was maybe going to talk about this, and maybe I'll talk about it next time. I'm sure you people know this piece. It's beautiful. It's great. Well, I often have people start by blocking it. And already we've made music. Now, I don't expect them to do it that fast. I'm trying to illustrate it right. But, if you look at the page, you might look at that and you think, well, how the heck did you figure that? But, for instance, let me give you some light. We're kind of losing it here. But, this is C and E. Well, we can play C and E as a chord. This is G, C, E. Well, that's a C major triad in second inversion, And you don't necessarily have to be able to label that. But if you can see it and block it and chunk it, then you have a way. So let's say Sally was playing a melody on the violin, and I didn't know this piece, and I had trouble reading it. I might just go, because that's all that happens in the first measure. That's all that it is. And then I might go to that. And I might have enough time that I think, oh yeah, okay, this is the G7. And then I'm going to go back to the CE, back to the 1 chord. Oh, okay, now I'm going to go to 6. Well, I'm labeling it just for the sake of labeling it. But the thing is, you slow it down enough that you're still reading, you're still playing it, but you're moving forward in time. Because sight reading is all about playing it in time and moving the music forward, moving the harmonies as much. Then later you might go, or, I mean, you can make it kind of jazzy too, right? And so there's various possibilities to work on reading, particularly if you're playing with other people. And that's something we could talk about even more. That's sort of it in a nutshell. Well, why don't we do that? Let's talk about fingering and sight reading next time. And, bring some pieces, maybe even tell me about some things you want to talk about. And I can prepare, but, I can figure it out on the fly, too. It's not a big deal if I don't have it first. So.
Do you talk about memorizing pieces? How they memorize?
Well, that's another thing we could talk about too.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Yeah.
Let's see how much time we have. We might be able to do all three of those.
Maybe it should be different topics for different days.
Well, that's
Like,
what I'm thinking. Memorization is a big one, although it goes along with the patterning too, right?
yes.
It goes
Yeah.
along with knowing these, and I talk about labeling these chords, but sometimes it's just a matter of feeling where they go and feeling how they're different, But
Yeah.
that's an important memorization, of course, is huge.
Yes.
But
And
let's,
then
mhm.
just so everyone knows, I have a Facebook group that I just put in the chat room.
Okay, I see that.
Wanna
Yeah.
join. Yeah, and I have a lot of pieces that I memorized. I'll put it in there too, and all the videos of how it sounds. But I don't know what level everyone is at.
We've got a range of people here.
Okay.
Yeah.
How do you memorize stuff?
What's that, me?
Yeah, how do you memorize, John?
So I'm used to patterns. That's why when you say C chord or all that, I kind of know what it is, but or fifth or sixth, I have no idea. I just have to. I'm just used to patterns and hearing the melody in my head when I play. So for me, it's easier for me to memorize if I can remember the pattern. And what Sophia told me last time when I saw in the classes that you had was if you change the speed and how you play it, it sticks to your fingers and your muscle memory a lot better. Kind of like doing the broken chords and going back to the same tempo of what it should be, or slowing it down to random places and get used to it. So yeah, that really helped out. So, but that's how I memorize.
Right, and muscle memory is a whole other. I mean, let's do a session on memorization. Maybe not this next week, but the following week, let's talk about memorization because there's so much that's involved with that. I mean, and it's wonderful if you know the theory. It's wonderful to be able to say 1, 4, 5, 7, 1, and know what that means. But also, you could kind of say, all right, well, I've got GCE in the right hand. Now I've got ACF. Okay, this feels like this. This sounds like that. This is how it moves. Now I'm going. Oh yeah. Okay. This is F, B, D, and then now I'm back to the chord. There's that aspect of it, and there's also even close your eyes, you feel where you're going. Then of course there's the melodic aspect, and then it would be interesting to talk about the role of YouTube with learning and memorization, because I get it if you're an amateur and you just want to kind of learn the pieces and you want to kind of test things out. But I will say this, if you truly want to learn to read music, you don't listen to it on YouTube first. Why do I say that? You don't, because, and there were pieces, there was modern music put in front of me. There was no YouTube recording. There was nothing of it. You had to know what the relationships were and figure it out. And then you become like, oh, that's what that sounds like.
Yeah, you can cheat nowadays. YouTube.
What's that?
You can cheat using YouTube nowadays.
Yeah, but it's interesting. You can always tell sometimes. There's certain recordings that people listen to, and you can hear the faults that are in that recording too.
Yes. Yep. Justin had mentioned it. I really think my goal is to teach people to be independent. It's like learning how to speak English. Are we always going to be consulting a language? Those of us, like a dictionary thing or one of those translator things. Those of us who grew up here. It's one thing if we go to Japan and we don't speak Japanese and we want a translator thing. But to really be fluent, we want to work with it. So, well, great. Well, I suppose we better not go too long. It's been an hour now. It's great to see everybody. I'll put up another announcement and link. I'll be changing it every week. But we'll definitely talk about fingering and reading, sight reading next time.